How do you rebuild? In the fall of 2021, we've all been through a lot of change. All change comes with a kind of loss. We live on the other side of this loss. So how do you rebuild? How do you build towards the future while honoring the hard-learned lessons of the past?
Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi, Bob. Hi. The bumper, I think, tells the story, right? We're at the tail end, or it seems like we've been in an 18-month reality and there's something that's on the horizon, and we're looking forward to seeing what that looks like and returning to some kind of normalcy and perhaps in routines being reintroduced this fall. There is some glimmer of that. But the truth of the matter is we have been through a season that has stretched us in all kinds of ways, has unsettled routines, has made things that we once took for granted and that we saw as predictable in our lives, and has changed them. How we work is different, whether or not at home or in the office or maybe a shared thing. All kinds of things are different, including just the understanding of how does Christian faith influence us in this season. What does it mean to attend church or not attend church, and all kinds of things. I don't have to say much about it. You are familiar with this. And as a faith community, we've decided that instead of just glossing over this or somehow pretending that, this is of little consequence and let's just continue to praise Jesus and just put a good, brave face on it, we decided that we would set aside a teaching series this fall to explore a little bit, and in our discovery about what is true and what is real, to discover and find resources, perhaps discover next steps that we could take to respond. And in order to do that, we've decided that we want to use the story of Nehemiah, which is a powerful story in the Old Testament. And I'm excited about us using Nehemiah because Nehemiah is my Bible character hero. He's the one I most want to emulate. I already have sort of an association with him. I have a sense that he feels deeply and I feel deeply. I'm often quickly moved to tears. He is about spending his time, his life, investing it in something meaningful, and that's certainly a desire that I have, that there would be some evidence of my having lived, and that's an important piece of the way I see myself in this world. I think he's an exceptional leader. The fact that he's able to rally a bunch of people to be about a single task is also something I find quite inspiring. And so there is a part of me that really longs to emulate this incredible leader and to be much more like him. I want to begin looking at the story to share with you some very curious nuggets out of chapter 3. And there's a whole bunch of these stories. These are not the only ones. But this gives you a little bit of a sense as to the people that are actually involved in the project of rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. These are just snippets out of a whole text that includes all kinds of family names and individuals. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gates. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hanal. Uzziel, son of Hariah, one of the goldsmiths, repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Shallum, son of Haloish, ruler of a half district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. These are the elements of the story, and there's dozens more listed. And this idea that Nehemiah arrives at the ruins of Jerusalem and invites people to rebuild this wall. And what happens is people who are not skilled masons, these are not the tradespeople of their day that would have had the understanding as to how to do this. These are people that would have broken some nails, and their carefully manicured and looked after hands would have suddenly been bruised and in some ways harmed because of the work they were doing. Because perfume makers, goldsmiths, these are not people that were used to that kind of physical labor, and yet they rose to the occasion. And I find this inspiring because part of me is thinking, yeah, this is the kind of story I can really lean into. I want to read more of it because I'm curious about what the outcome is. What does it look like when a group of people just rally around a common cause? There's a certain romance to it. I love those kinds of stories when people decide to do something that almost seems impossible, and they do it together. But our Bibles are honest enough to not only include the beautiful, glossy details of a successful story, but they also include the elements, the reality of circumstances. And no sooner are we into this and we discover some interesting things. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they're building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." And there is your resistance. There is your opposition. And instantly the romance disappears and the story suddenly becomes about a group of people wanting to accomplish something. And there are enemies. There are people who want to oppose this effort, who want to undermine the success of this. How does Nehemiah respond? This is what it says. Right in the middle of the text, without any transition of any kind, without perhaps concluding a portion and then moving into this piece, inserted into this is this quick little prayer that Nehemiah speaks. And he says this, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." And this is another reason why Nehemiah is such a compelling hero in my life, because over and over again in this writing of Nehemiah's story, there are these prayers inserted. This is, in fact, his response. How often do I, when I confront some challenge in life, do I spend all of my energy trying to solve it on my own, trying to conquer the thing with all of the strength and all the resources available to me? And it is only when I come to the end of me, when I start running out of ability, that is when I turn and say, well, I guess the least thing I could do is to pray. And I almost pray as I sort of dropped the ball on this. I guess I'm going to have to finally turn it over to someone who can do something about it. And yet, I am convinced of this truth, that prayer is our single most powerful response to the circumstances of our life. And Nehemiah models this beautifully, where he simply prays and says, "Hey God, are you aware of what's happening? Can you be part of this?" And I love that. And I want prayer to be my first response. This is actually how this story starts. Look at this earlier in the text of Nehemiah. It says this. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, so he's a close personal advisor. And one day he steps into the presence of the king, and the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This could be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, Nehemiah writes, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want? What is it you want?" This is an extraordinary invitation. And here is the response. "Then I prayed to the God of heaven and I answered the king." What is it you want is the question. The answer is about to come from Nehemiah. He's in the presence of the king. He's not going to keep the king waiting with his answer. This is not a moment for a powerful sort of pause, but this is something where the king is asked a question, I need to respond. And yet between the question asked and the question answered, there is this brief moment. And in that it says, then I prayed to the God of heaven. How long was that prayer? What were the words of that prayer that Nehemiah inserted? To ask the most extraordinary, for him to be sent to Jerusalem to attend to the ruins of the city. I love that about Nehemiah. I love this truth that's captured for us here, that he prayed, was aware of God's presence, and called on him also. Our story of rebuilding the wall continues. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their hearts. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. How does the story unfold? But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. The practical response of Nehemiah and his leadership, he understood that there was prayer that he was about to continue this relationship with God, and at the same time, he takes some physical action. And I want to say to you that as much as we have been, and we are still in some ways in these circumstances we find ourselves in that have limited our life and have really changed the way we engage in life, that at any one of these points, as much as we may declare our confidence in God, that there is an invitation for us to contemplate, what is a step that I can take? What is something that I can do to respond? Nehemiah is deliberate to do both. The story continues. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out. There's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. The threat is growing real. There is the evidence that there's physical violence coming their way, that people are going to try to interfere with rebuilding the wall. The story unfolds. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. You see how Nehemiah's awareness of the presence of God remains. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked, but the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. Can you imagine what this looked like? The people carried building materials in one hand and weaponry in the other to defend themselves. This was a real threat. This required real response. This required a response that was the right response, the reasonable one in light of the threat that was coming their way. All designed to undermine the work of rebuilding this wall. We return to the story. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I nor my brothers nor my men nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. This describes a circumstance of a people group whose routines were entirely unsettled. They literally arranged their days and their nights to suit this reality that they were living in, the threat that was real, to try to be about the project that was in front of them. This is a group of people that understood what it looked like for their routines to be unsettled and for things that they once counted on to be different and for them to be, in some ways, in a constant state of the pressure of the circumstances. And again, we can relate to this because we know what this feels like. I think all of us have gained a deep appreciation for the realities of mental health. And if there was ever a stigma attached to mental health that remained, I think it's mostly disappeared now, because I think we have the permission to say to one another, as a result of the circumstances we've experienced, that we notice the state of our mental health and some of the struggles that we have to name, the anxiety, the depression, the things that have become true for us. This was true for the people who were about this project. They understood that everything about their life was now rearranged. But the story continues. So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all of our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. The wall got rebuilt. The project that Nehemiah invited people to, that they participated in with all of their heart and all of their strength, got done. And I find this part fascinating, and it plays again into my desire to be like Nehemiah, because I know this truth, and that is that if you went to Jerusalem and if you dug far enough down, you would come across a section of the wall around Jerusalem that doesn't look like it was laid by masons. It looked like somebody threw it together to the best of their ability, because the people of their day rallied around there, and therefore there to be evidence of a life that has been invested in something of great significance that outlasts a lifetime is very intriguing to me. And Nehemiah has this as his record in his lifetime, to recognize that he was part of building this wall. So it's a wonderful story. And as the Old Testament offers us this great insight to give us stories where we see the interaction of God and his people, the people out of which finally Jesus would come, and the Christian faith that we celebrate here at 139 Smith could come into being as a result of stories like this. And it's been our practice at the Meeting Place that when we look at an Old Testament text, we try to find a related New Testament text for us to discover application, things that we can take with us that would speak to our lifetime here and now. Because I don't know about you, but my life isn't currently occupied by rebuilding a wall physically. I'm not carrying boulders and stones to add them to that. I'm not mixing up mortar. The things that I'm dealing with are a different kind of challenge, and I too can name the threats and the opposition in my life. And so we turn to a familiar text found in Ephesians Chapter 6. These are words written by a man named the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament. He finds himself in prison. And one day he sits down and starts writing a letter that is going to go to the church in Ephesus and perhaps be passed around to other churches in the surrounding area. And it says this: "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." And whenever I read a text like this, I am reminded that if I take a careful look at my life circumstances, I see the evidence of resistance and opposition in my life. And I'm not prone to look for demons everywhere. I'm not sort of wired to think about spiritual warfare as something I need to constantly live under a threat of. And yet at the same time, I realize that Jesus, in his desire to reconcile the world to himself, has a real enemy. And this real enemy is in opposition of this reconciliation work of Jesus. And this enemy decides to destroy and undermine what Christian faith is all about. And this enemy finds a way to accomplish his purposes, sometimes by messing with my life and with yours, to try to knock us off track, Peter, who is a follower of Jesus, writes it this way: "Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings." Capturing the individual reality, the idea that the devil is looking to devour someone, comes down to a person. But also, Peter writes here about the reality that this actually affects people who are of Christian faith around the world. And here's an interesting thing. During this pandemic, we have never been more like a global village than we have now. We can relate to people all around the globe because we've all been subject to the same kinds of conditions. This doesn't happen very often in the history of our world, and yet it is true for us now. And for us to understand that churches that are gathered in all kinds of places in the world are experiencing some of these realities is an important thing to note. There is real opposition. And so there's a part of me, aren't you in some ways curious as to what Paul is going to write next in Ephesians? How is he going to respond? What's he going to say to us about what we do with the fact that there is this opposition? And recognize that Paul, at this moment, is in a prison cell. Likely the imagery that he's using here is because he sees that Roman soldier standing just outside of his cell, or maybe he remembers the day when he was arrested, or maybe he's seen enough Roman soldiers, and as he's in prison for his faith, he recalls the image of that, and he uses that language to describe it. And here he goes: "Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything to stand, so brace yourself, arm yourself, so that you can engage in this battle. And when the battle is done, you will stand." And here are the elements of this armor. "Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with a breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." These are the elements of the armor. And you know what strikes me about these is that Paul, who is in circumstances that he wouldn't choose, he would want to get out of them, he doesn't want to stay in those circumstances, is able to write these incredibly encouraging words. And in response to the people who may say, well, how is it that we deal with the threats and the difficulties of life, he says to them, put on the full armor of God. And when we read through it, and knowing full well we could develop a teaching series around each and every one of these themes, what he writes and what he offers to us are things that in themselves aren't very mysterious. They're readily available to people of Christian faith. These are words, these are concepts that we are familiar with, that we can use. There's nothing specifically mystical about these responses. It's about the belt of truth, the truth of Jesus, that what he says and what is true of Jesus is true for all times, for all places, and for all people. It's about the breastplate of righteousness, righteousness to be in right relationship with Jesus. What is my relationship status with him? What is yours? Are we in a vibrant relationship with him? Do we long for that? Or has it gotten a little cold? But righteousness is available to us. The gospel of peace. My mind is in turmoil. My world is in turmoil. My soul is in turmoil at times. What do I need? What do I want? What do I long for? I long for peace. For us to understand that the shield of faith, the simple declaration that Jesus is who he says he is, and that the promises that he makes we can trust. Shield us from the flaming arrows of the enemy. There's someone who wants to start a fire in your garbage bin. But faith stands in response. For us to understand the helmet of salvation, think about all the things that go on in our thoughts. Think about those words that speak to you, that undermine your confidence, that perhaps just simply confirm what you already somehow know in your spirit, and that is that you're not enough. Do you have such words play in your mind? The helmet of salvation, to know that we have been saved by Jesus, that we've been rescued from a life that is without hope, that we've been rescued from the catastrophe things would be without Jesus. is a powerful antidote to those thoughts. For us to understand that we are to pick up the sword. The sword is the Word of God. Paul didn't even have access to this entire Bible during his time, but he understood that whereas all of these other weapons are defensive weapons, when the enemy brings the battle to us, this is a weapon that takes a battle to our enemy. This is what's available to us. And then Paul finishes with these words. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Two pieces. Once again, I love this idea of the prayer. Like Nehemiah responds to the king, what do you want? Jesus stands and says, what do you want? And look at the permission we're given here. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. I don't think that you and I can come up with a prayer request that is too ridiculous. I know people who pray for a parking lot when they pull up to a shopping mall. They find the most extraordinary parking spaces. What are we praying about? Apparently, we have permission to pray about virtually anything. Nehemiah says to the king, what do I want? I want to go to Jerusalem and rebuild a wall. What might we say to Jesus who says, what do you want? And then the confirmation, with this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all of the Lord's people. We are in this together. That we pray for one another is a powerful thing. I pray for you, you pray for me, and life is better. This, my friends, is the armor that is offered to us to deal with the circumstances that we face. It's not magical. It's not mysterious. These are real things that we can place our confidence in. And I so hope that you will be blessed to be able to take on this armor. And if Christian faith is unfamiliar to you because you just don't know enough about it yet, you're still exploring, would you please reach out? We'd love to explain more of this. But for some of us, we have been followers of Jesus for a long time, but we need to be reminded that there's an armor that's available that will actually give us the capacity to face the opposition, the turmoil, the threats in our lifetime. And I wish that for you.
Thank you so much, Pastor Bob, for reminding us this morning of the God that we can stand firm in and the Jesus that calls us to equip ourselves with the armor that he provides us. Lots of questions. I'll ask 3. By rulers and principalities and powers, could the writer be referring to a manifestation of evil embodying the systems of oppression which are working against social justice?
Yes.
Okay.
We sometimes, when we consider power, I think that we should see power in a number of sources. That there is actually, and of course our world history will tell us, there have been times when the political powers of the day embodied that kind of evil. They were clearly associated with the one who was trying to undermine the work of Christian faith. That's not always true, but it certainly has been true historically. And so for us to recognize, yes, that power can find manifestation in the systems and the social structures, in all of that. Absolutely true, yeah.
Okay. Folks can interpret your teachings as they wish. For those who are vaccinated, they could see it as we are being tested by the virus and we need to stay strong. Those who oppose vaccines can interpret your teaching as them being persecuted. How can we interpret the truth? Can both be right?
Yeah. Let me give this response. I think we need to be careful when we use the word persecution.
Okay.
Persecution applies in circumstances where the surroundings, the enemies of our faith, challenge our ability to express Christian faith and to continue to tell the story of Jesus. This has not been true during the pandemic. I can continue to practice my Christian faith. I can continue to speak about Christian faith. I can, in fact, still have conversations with people. They may be different. They may not be face-to-face. They may not be without masks. but I have all the permissions to still be a person of faith and to invite people into circumstances of faith. So I do not describe our circumstances at present to be persecution, because they do not threaten that reality. And I think persecution is limited to applying only in that situation.
That's really helpful. Thank you. This one, I think, is one person wrote it in, but I suspect many people could have written this one in, and that is, how do we stand firm when we are so tired and broken that we've become too weak to stand?
Yeah. So I will be honest with you. In contemplation, the invitation for you to stand, I wrestled with it. Even stepping onto the stage today, there was a part of me that was somewhat reluctant, and yet I also wanted to make sure that we marked the occasion and invited a moment where there was opportunity for you and I to respond in the circumstances we found ourselves in, and to give each other permission to stand or not to stand. But I'm aware of the weight of a bunch of people standing around you, and then for you to sit by yourself feels a little, it doesn't feel quite fair.
It's lonely.
It's lonely. It's all of those things, which adds then further to the pressure. But I do want to acknowledge, my friends, Paul was in prison. His life was not this beautiful, glorious tale because he was a follower of Jesus, had been invited by Jesus himself to play this critical role. No, Paul experienced the kinds of persecution that you and I have no experience in. The kinds of things that he experienced, I think, would have left him very much in a place where he might have asked himself, can I really trust this Jesus? And yet he reminds us over and over again, for those of you that are feeling that you cannot stand, I invite you to be real about that. As Nehemiah turned to the king, what do you want? Jesus turns to you and says, what do you want? And say it like it is. Say it like it is. And perhaps it needs to be something, again, where we've talked about this in our community, where you need a friend who can hear that, to maybe speak some of these words, because they're maybe hard to hear. But if there's a friend who could say, this is what I believe to be true of Jesus in your circumstances, they can remind you of the hope. So don't remain alone in your aloneness. Do reach out, identify yourself and say, I need help. But Jesus is ready to say, what do you want? I would love to respond. I would love to attend to that matter.
I love how you just answered that question in a way that says, when you feel like you're not strong enough to stand, it's not like there's something wrong with you or you're not good enough or Jesus is disappointed. It means that this is the time to let him know that's where you're at.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol.
Lots of questions. I'll give you a few. You mentioned about how the stigma of mental health is gone, you thought? And you said, if we recognize that the stigma of mental health is gone, and that is a great issue, why are there not any real resources? And if there are, where are they?
Yeah, first of all, let me just revisit the idea that the stigma around mental health is gone. I don't know if it's gone entirely, but I would say that in the circles that I travel, whether it's with people of faith or people who are not of faith, there is much more room for people to speak about their mental health. And that in some ways encourages me, because I think it gives permission for more people to be honest about that. As far as resources, yeah, that's a very interesting question for us to attend to those kinds of things. So yes, as a faith community, if you need resources, please be in touch. Call the office and we will set you up with people, agencies that can respond to your circumstances in particular. We have a pastoral team. We would be happy to sit with you and spend time hearing your story, assisting you to the best of our ability. Here's the interesting part. We don't know. We know there's needs. We know that this is true of a larger portion of our faith community. But in some ways, we can't respond unless you declare yourself, unless you reach out. And that puts a lot of pressure on you. I'm sorry that that's the circumstance. So to the best of our ability, I will say that sometimes the Spirit prompts and says, like, here's a name of a person you should probably call, and I'll make the call, and it turns out that it was really a timely thing, and so we do want to respond. But please, if you would take the risk of calling, we would love to assist you with that so that you can find the help that you need.
Okay. This next question, when I read it, when it came in, actually brought me to tears.
Yeah.
And so I'd invite your response. In this season, some of us feel like we are battling and standing with Jesus and loving others by getting the vaccine, and some feel the opposite, that Jesus is calling to stand against the mandates. How do we live with this tension and continue to love our neighbors?
Yeah. Well, this certainly is a divisive subject, and it's been complicated, and it's complicated in your workplaces, in your homes. It's certainly complicated here at church. So the premise of our faith community is that we have always desired to remove as many obstacles as we possibly could for people to come. And in this instance, leadership finds itself in a tricky spot because by removing obstacles, we've also made it unsafe for people to come into a building where those who are vaccinated and not vaccinated gather. We have not spoken from the stage and said, in order for you to contribute to this faith community, that you should be vaccinated. It felt to us in leadership that it would be similar to us advising you as to which political party you should vote for, etc. And perhaps you don't understand the difference of those two things, but here is the thing. Whether you choose to be vaccinated or not, we cannot find a specific command in the Bible that without interpretation would address this thing directly. And because there isn't an instruction like that, for example, the instruction for us to pray is clearly visible in Scripture, but this one doesn't have such an instruction. So you can interpret that in order for us to be good to our neighbors that we should be vaccinated. Fair, but that's subject to an interpretation. So really, this is a non-moral choice. In other words, there isn't a right and wrong. And I will tell you that I've spoken with people who are vaccinated, who are double vaccinated, who would wish for everyone to be double vaccinated, who have very strong convictions on the subject. But I'm also speaking to people on the other side of that equation, and their convictions stand as strong. So because we cannot declare a right and wrong, or perhaps because we refuse to declare a right and wrong, because it does create the us and them scenario, which is already created by the circumstance, we do not want to contribute to that. We extend compassion to both sides of this. And that's a choice that we've made. There could be other leaders who would choose otherwise, but that's the direction that we've taken so far. And yes, this has caused sadness, tears, grief on both sides of this equation.
The king asks Nehemiah, what is it that you want? So if Pastor Bob has asked this question for TMP, what is it that you want? What would you say?
I'm not hesitating. I just feel deeply. The life that Jesus invites us to is not an ordinary life. And I would love for us, as a faith community, as individuals, as ministry teams, in whatever circumstances we gather, whether it's the worship team or it's the drama team or it's the ushers, if it's the youth leadership team, the children's ministry people, whoever and however you are, I would love for us to experience the fullness of what that would be like. To not settle for the ordinary. Why would we do that? Let's go after the extraordinary. Do you think there were people amongst those who stood on the ruins of Jerusalem who thought Nehemiah was nuts to rebuild the city wall? And yet they did it in 52 days. And when they were done, I think they probably looked at this wall and thought to themselves, how did we do that? I think Jesus invites us into something. And as a faith community, I think it's time for us to say we will not settle for the ordinary. We're going to be about the extraordinary. What is Jesus asking? And so I would turn it around and say, Jesus says, what do you want? You know what I want? I want what he wants, because he knows better. And what he wants is extraordinary for us.
Thank you, Bob, for your
That's
passion.
my quick answer.
Thank you for your passion and your wisdom.
Thanks, Carolyn. This armor that Paul speaks of is real. It's real stuff. It's things that we can pick up, things that we can identify in our life, and it will give us the capacity to respond to life circumstances, whatever challenges may come our way. And I want to share with you some words to bless you, perhaps to re-emphasize the truth of this one more time, and to say this. This is out of Romans chapter 8. It says this: "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." The truth of Jesus is true for all people, in all places, for all time. Be blessed.